Western medicine, the medicine in which I was trained, separates the mind from the body. So in the Western medical mind, and I'll prove this to you in a minute, certain questions just don't arise. So I'm going to just ask you in this audience, if in the last 5 years you've been to any kind of a specialist, otolaryngologist, a throat specialist, or a ear, nose, and throat specialist, or a gastroenterologist, or a cardiologist, or a neurologist, or a rheumatologist, or a dermatologist, just raise your hand, would you? Okay, so quite a few people here. Now, raise your hand again if your ologist of any kind asks you about your childhood relationship with your parents. Anybody? Nobody so far? Okay, ask see if they've ever been traumatized. Did they ever ask you that? Anybody ask you how you feel about yourself as a human being? What is your self-concept? Do you like yourself? Do you not like yourself? Did they ask you about stress on the job? Did they ask you about that maybe? Nobody? Right. Because the Western medical mind separates the mind from the body. And so when you come in with a physical problem, that's all it is. It's the physical problem. The fact that the mind and body are inseparable, not only are they inseparable theoretically, they're inseparable in practice. And not only are they inseparable, but we actually have the science that shows exactly how inseparable they are. It's not like this is voodoo medicine. This is up-to-date science. Despite the fact that the science shows the unity, practice cleaves them into two. And not only do we separate the mind from the body, the emotions from the physiology, we also separate the individual from the environment. How have we understood that it's not so much that there's a human nature that predicts behavior, but what there actually is a human nature that means that we have certain needs. And if those needs are met, we're going to behave in predictable ways. And if those needs are not met, we're also going to behave in predictable ways. So it's not our behavior that defines our nature, but our needs that define our nature. And the behaviors reflect the degree to which those needs are met, or they are not met. And what if we look at it from that point of view? Well, what do we find from that point of view? And how would looking at human nature from that angle lead us to understand what we call physical or mental pathology? And I say what we call because diagnosis and pathology and so on is just a certain way of looking at something. It doesn't necessarily reflect reality. Or it might describe a certain reality, but it doesn't necessarily explain reality. And we have to make a distinction between descriptions and explanations. So what is human nature? Well, I mean, what is the need of any human child? And it doesn't matter what human child. Whether you're looking at humans living close to the North Pole or the South Pole, in the East or the West, in Europe or in Africa or Asia or North America or wherever, what are the needs of a human child? Well, the essential need of the human child is for attachment. Now, attachment is a biological drive for connection with another human being. And it's an essential drive because without it we can't survive. The human being is the human child is the most immature, most dependent, and most vulnerable creature in the universe. So without somebody looking after her or him, they just don't survive. So that attachment drive, you can say that's part of our human nature. In other words, we're born for love. In other words, for attachment is love. Not only the love of the child or the attachment of the child to the parent, but the attachment of the parent to the child. So attachment is this drive that pulls two human beings together for the purpose of being taken care of or for the purpose of taking care of. And of course, attachment also pulls human beings together for reasons throughout the lifespan. The human beings did not live the way we live through most of human existence. So if that wall in the room represents the beginning of human evolution millions of years ago, And if that wall over there represents our present day, then until this far away from that wall there, we lived in small band hunter-gatherer grouping. 60 to 80 to 100 human beings living together. And that meant that children were always around their parents. Always around their parents. There was no separation. Not just around their parents, but around the whole group of adults, all of whom acted as parental figures in a child's life. So a child grew up ensconced in a network of very safe attachments. Safe in the sense that everybody cared for the child. Number one. Number two, when you study hunter-gatherer groups, they always carry their kids everywhere. The North American natives had the papoose where they carried the kids everywhere. In Nigeria, I think, or Kenya, there was a newspaper article about 10 years ago I read, rather amusing. Somebody, I think in Nairobi, Kenya, opened a pram store, like a baby buggy store. And it wasn't doing very well. And the reporter asked the shop owner, well, how come you're not doing better business in this big modern city? He said, well, our people just don't understand why they put the kids into a machine and push them. They carry them everywhere. Now, it's not infrequent these days to see a parent pushing a buggy and playing with the cell phone at the same time. Do we think that the kid in the buggy whose parent is on a cell phone is getting the same kind of information about the world as the baby who's being carried on the parent's chest or back or belly? The third thing about hunter-gatherer groupings, and the reason I'm talking about them is because that's human nature. That's how we evolved. That was our nature. So the first thing is that there's small groups living together, and kids had many adult attachments, many adults looking after them, protecting them, mentoring them. Number one. Number two, the kids were carried everywhere. Number three, they didn't let their kids cry. Now, when I say didn't let them cry, I don't mean that they forbade crying. You can't forbid a 2-month-old from crying. But they wouldn't, if they cried, they were immediately cuddled. Now, here in North America, we actually tell parents, we teach parents not to pick up their kids when they're crying. That's called sleep training. We're actually telling parents, don't pick up your kids when they're crying at night because we want them to sleep through the night. And if you pick them up, they'll learn that they can just wake you up in the middle of the night and, and then you can't go to work in the morning. I'll say something about more of that later. So that's the third thing. They just let their kids cry. The fourth thing is, generally, hunter-gatherer groupings don't hit their kids. And if they do, it's only in an acute situation when the kid is about to crawl into an anthill, and you pick him up and you quickly slap him on the bottom, teaching him not to do that. But there's not a question of spanking as punishment. It's very interesting. I'll read you there was a novel published in Canada about the interaction of the European colonists and the native First Nations people. This author actually went back to the documents of the time, and it's a recorded fact that the Europeans were appalled at the parenting practices of the natives because the natives didn't hit their kids. And to the Europeans, this meant sparing the rod, spoiling the child. So in this particular novel, there's a Jesuit that writes home to his superiors in France, and he says about the natives, the sauvages, the savages. Children and dogs run around without care, rolling in the dirt with one another. If there's one thing I will never grow accustomed to, it's the savages' inability to chastise their children. In all my years, I've never even seen an adult raise a hand in anger toward a child. Indeed, this should be one of the first behaviors we must try to modify. So the Europeans were really aghast at the fact that these people didn't hit their kids. So, multiple adult attachments, being with the adults all the time physically, not being hit, and not being allowed to cry. Now, why does a kid cry? We're still talking about human nature here and what happens to it. Why does a kid cry? Well, kids got no other way to ask for help but to cry. So crying is a sign of distress, and what can the distress be over? We're distressed when our needs aren't being met. So if we're hungry, a baby will cry. If they're uncomfortable because the diaper is dirty and wet, they're going to cry. If they need attachment contact, they will cry. When the needs are met, the child is soothed and eased and their nervous system relaxes. When the needs are denied, the child gets more riled up. When the child is riled up, you get stress hormones going through the whole body to the brain. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, particularly cortisol. Cortisol interferes with healthy brain development. When we don't pick up our kids, we're interfering with their brain development. You didn't have to tell Aboriginal people this, but in our modern society, you have to teach this, and people say, oh my God, really? That's not what my doctor told me. They told me, and as a doctor, I used to tell people the same kind of nonsense. Don't pick them up. Let them cry through the night. So what I'm saying is that from the very beginning in this society, we're denying people's essential needs for healthy development. Right from the get-go. And haven't even said anything about how we medicalized birth and people no longer have natural births, and that itself is a problem. And then we live in a very stressed society. So the parents are stressed. And when the parents are stressed, the kids are stressed. It's that simple. Because children utterly rely, children have no self-regulation. So if you're stressed as an adult, if you're mature enough, you can regulate yourself. You can take a few breaths, you can calm yourself down, you can say, okay, slow down, let me think about this, let me deal with this. An infant can't do that. Infant's got no self-regulation whatsoever. But the only way that the infant can regulate their internal, no, you know what it's like when you're upset. Your heart is racing, your blood pressure is up, your nervous system is on fire, your guts might be churning or stopping, muscles are tense, everything changes about you. Same with the infant, except the infant has no capacity to regulate themselves. The infant's brain requires the mature function of the adult's brain to regulate it. I'm quoting Dr. Dan Siegel, a UCLA psychiatrist and child development expert. So the infant's brain requires the mature function of the adult's brain to regulate itself. But what if the adult's brain is not functioning maturely because that adult themselves never got the right conditions for the healthy development? Now you have an immature adult's brain regulating or trying to regulate an immature infant's brain. So the self-regulation never develops. And when you stress parents, well, for example, I mentioned asthma. When you stress parents, that affects the child's physiology. We see that emotions can't be separated from the physiology because somehow a this episode increases the chance that your lungs will be inflamed and your airways will be narrowed, which means the emotion, whatever you experienced, probably suppressed rage or shame, whatever you experienced, actually affects the physiology of your lungs. And if your parents are stressed, that also affects the physiology of your lungs. In other words, the separation is unscientific and it's untenable in real life.